Hey everyone, so as I mentioned in my previous video, unfortunately my microphone became unplugged from my camera, so I wasn't able to capture audio on all of the rest of this Miata brake install. However, I'm going to go ahead and just give you a basic narration explaining what exactly I'm doing. So the Wilwood caliper uses a standard or American thread, right? So I'm going to go ahead and remove the old fittings that I'd had there before, and I'm going to go ahead and put in the line from 949 Racing. I want to say that it's a MPT fitting. What it uses, I don't remember the size, but for the sake of conversation, say it's probably like a quarter-inch MPT. However, if you have the caliper and you have the line, trust me, they'll work. You don't really need to know the size. Here I am kind of tucking in my head into the wheel well. Probably not the safest thing, by the way. Sometimes I need to see. So once I had that fitting out, I went ahead and threaded in the line from 949 Racing. Now you'll notice that this line uses an adapter into the caliper, and then it attaches to that adapter using an AN fitting, which is what I'm loosening there. You can go ahead and actually undo the line and remove it fully, or just leave it loose, whatever is comfortable for you. But what you want to do first is just actually to tighten down that fitting that goes directly into the Wilwood caliper. So you'll see me do that here. In a second, I'm going to end up taking the line off just because I felt that it was in the way. So you'll see that momentarily. So there, I took the line off. I'm going to finish tightening the fitting into the caliper by hand. Now remember, these calipers are made out of aluminum, so you don't want to overdo it. Just go down till they're snug and you feel it nice and tight, but don't go crazy. Don't come torque on this with a big lever arm, right? Small wrench like that is plenty. Right there, I felt that that was enough, so then I went ahead and I put the line back on, just threaded that AN portion. That is the easy part. Now the other end has an M10 by 1 mm thread. That one I know for a fact, and you need to attach that end to the factory hardline on the Miata. Now the factory hardline on the Miata will 100% be seized if you have an older car, unless your car is absolutely pristine. So you're going to have to employ a technique that I'm going to show you in the next clip. So here's where the factory rubber brake line meets up with the factory hard line. Now this is seized on my car, or was seized on my car, will most likely be seized on yours, and the very simple way to go ahead and unseize this is to take a micro torch and heat that junction up. Once you've heated it up a good amount, I basically just kind of hang on there for like a minute or so. I then take PB Blaster. PB Blaster is normally used for loosening, fittings and stuff that I've seized. So what I'm actually using it for in this case is I'm heating it up with the torch, and then I'm hitting that junction with PB Blaster. What that will do is it will rapidly cool it. Now whenever you have corrosion in between something and something is seized, if you expand it and contract it, the two parts will expand and contract at different rates, and that is just a very easy way to kind of break up something that has seized. So once I get that up to temperature, spray it with a PB Blaster, and after that you'll see that I'll be able to just turn my wrench, and it'll be a very simple thing to do. Now at this point, my factory calipers are still connected via the factory rubber brake line over to the factory hard line. Now in order to minimize how much brake fluid is going to leak out of that junction when I undo the rubber hose from the hard line, I'm going to go ahead and use a transfer pump to take all the fluid that's in the reservoir for the master cylinder and put it into this old empty milk container. So you'll just see that the fluid coming out of there is disgusting. So it's a great idea to get rid of it anyway. I didn't intend to use it for bleeding the new calipers anywho, because that fluid was kind of ugly and gross. So I'm just going to go ahead and transfer that over. These milk jugs, I've noticed, can hold brake fluid for quite a while without any deformation or damage. So it's a good thing to know. It can basically last you until you're able to get to somewhere where you can legally, dispose of your brake fluid. And that, just basically is going to minimize the amount of mess that you have to deal with when you go to undo the factory caliper. So here's my factory caliper, and I'm just going to go ahead and undo the bolt there. It's a banjo bolt that holds the factory brake line onto that caliper. Second I undo that, as I back that off, there's going to be a little bit of fluid leaking, so I'm going to go ahead and quickly tuck that into my handy dandy milk jug there, and basically just allow that to drain off into that, and then I'll go work on the other end where I'll release that rubber line from the factory hard line. So at this point I'm finally at the factory hard line, so I'm going to go ahead and take a 10mm flare nut wrench and undo that. Please do not attempt to do this using a standard 10mm flat wrench. You will round out that fitting and hate yourself forever for having done that. It's basically a major headache. So go ahead and undo that. Once you really kind of like take the pressure off of it, sometimes you can turn these by hand, depending on the angle of the line and how it meets up with the thread. That may not be possible. Here I had to turn the wrench quite a bit. There's usually quite a bit of thread on these fittings just to make sure that they seal, so you'll kind of just be hanging out here turning a wrench for a good while, and it does get kind of annoying, but once it's all undone, you can move on to the next step, which is where you're going to attach your new stainless brake line over to this factory hard line, and you can be done with it. The only thing that you'll have to do before that is remove the retaining clip that's holding the rubber hose in place, and I'll show you how to do that shortly. So here I am with a set of pliers trying to pull out that retaining clip, and usually this is a major nightmare to do. I wasn't successful in this particular attempt. However, I, in my frustration, decided that I would put a flathead screwdriver in through the back and tap on it with a hammer in order to tap this retaining clip out. What I ended up discovering was, one, there's not really enough space to do that even with a stubby screwdriver, and two, you can just take the claws on the back of a standard claw hammer and kind of just pry on that clip right there, and it will slide right out with very little drama. So from then on, that's exactly what I did. Unfortunately, I did not capture that on video, but basically just kind of hook the claws like that, like what I'm doing with my finger, and just pull it out. So with that retaining clip out, I was able to pull the rubber hose down and away from the factory hard line, and then I'm going to go ahead and pop my new stainless steel line from SuperMiata in its place. So I kind of just aligned the tube into the inside of it. Then I started turning it once I mated the threads from the hard line to it. So you'll just see me here turning this for a little while, and then at some point I'll go ahead and I will grab that line, the hex end of the line, using a standard flat wrench that you can use a standard flat wrench for, and then I'll use my 10mm flare nut wrench to grab the factory hard line up top, and I'll go ahead and tighten that junction until they're both nice and snug so that they seal and I don't have to worry about brake leak here. You will, once you're bleeding, check on these and make sure that they are tight enough. You'll want to take a look and just make sure that no fluid is coming out from there. If you tighten it snugly, I highly doubt that that will be the case. But your mileage may vary, so it always pays to check that when you're bleeding, because the last thing you need is to have a point where your brake fluid is leaking out of while you're trying to bleed the brakes. Bleeding brakes is complex or annoying enough without contribution from leakage. Once the two lines have been snugged down together, I'll just go ahead and replace the factory retaining clip. So there I had it upside down, I had to turn it back around. You always want that kind of like 90-degree bent part to face away from the bracket. So there I am, just kind of sliding into place. Then you can just go ahead and take a hammer, rubber mallet, etc., and just finish tapping it all the way down. And with that, that connection is complete, and you can move on to do the next brake line. So at this point, we're at the part of the job that I don't like very much, but is also exciting to me because it means that I'm going to get to test out my new brakes really soon. So as you see me pointing there, the Wilwood calipers have these small fittings up there. they basically have two fittings into the caliper. There's a brass one, and then there's the actual standard bleeding nipple. So the reason that they do that is because when you're bleeding, if you're turning a thread in and out of an aluminum body, you're going to wear out that thread over time. So they very intelligently put the brass fitting in there, and then the bleed nipple that you'll be turning in and out when you do your bleeding, in order to keep you from wearing out your caliper. So it's much better to wear out that brass adapter, and if it does wear out over time, you just replace it as opposed to replacing an entire caliper. I think is a much better trade-off. Now I'm gonna go ahead and just loosen those using a standard socket wrench. Then I kind of snug them back down just enough that I can easily undo it with a flat wrench. Then I'm coming in here and connecting a rubber hose. Now, before I go ahead and start bleeding, I'm obviously going to have to fill my master cylinder back up, so I'm going to take some brand new DOT4 brake fluid and pour it in. Typically, when I do these brake upgrades, until I'm 100% certain that the system is going to hold pressure and work the way I want it to, I'm not going to go ahead and put in expensive brake fluid. So you'll notice that that's the AutoZone stuff. I'm not putting in Brembo HTC64T. I'm not putting in Castro SRF. I'm just going to go with the standard stuff, just to make sure that I can get everything working as intended and nothing is leaking. And then when I'm done with that, before I go out to a track event or something similar, then I'll go ahead and flush out this old fluid and replace it with something higher end. And it's just something that I recommend doing so that you're not spending a ton of money on good brake fluid at the risk of something either leaking or not working the way you intended it to, and then you've thrown away your money on high quality brake fluid. At this point in the video, I'm just showing the factory brake proportioning valve and explaining how I intend to replace it with a Wilwood one from SuperMiata. Now, by the time you see this video, I would have already done so. As a matter of fact, as I'm recording this narration, I've already done so. I was kind of just explaining there how I wish I would have gotten around to doing it all at the same time, such that I would have only had to bleed brakes once. However, I wanted to kind of space out my expenses as far as this brake project, just to keep it fairly affordable, and of course, until I got the next set of mods, I wanted to be able to actually enjoy the car and test out the new brakes. Now, at this point, I'm back at the brake caliper. Realistically, you have to go ahead and bleed your rear brakes first, and on the case of the Miata, you actually bleed your driver's side rear first, just because of the way that the brake lines go. Typically, you want to start from the furthest line away from the brake master cylinder, which is normally on a standard car in the passenger side rear. Just because of the way Mazda routed the lines, they actually go, over to the driver's side rear last, because they go to the passenger side rear first. So I actually went ahead and did that, bled from driver's side rear over to the passenger side rear, and then moved over to the front where the Wilwoods are and did that. Obviously, there's no value in showing that in this particular video, simply because we're focusing on these Wilwoods. The process is going to be exactly the same. You connect the hose, the other end of that hose goes off into a container to catch brake fluid. In my case, I'm using a soda bottle. I think it's a bottle of Sprite or Coca-Cola or something like that. But basically, I've drilled a hole in the cap and just big enough to route that rubber hose through. That hose goes all the way into the bottle and all the way to the bottom. So I'm just going to go ahead at this point and take a wrench and open that bleed screw. However, I'm not doing that at random. I have someone in the driver's seat pumping the brake pedal, and I'm telling them pump it 3 to 4 times. Then I'm telling them to hold it, right? And once they hold, I go ahead and turn that bleed screw, and you'll see that fluid comes out of there. And once that fluid is out, then I'll evaluate to see how much air is in the line, and I'll keep doing this process over and over, right? Like, I'll close it, I'll ask them to pump, hold, open it, evaluate the line, the air that comes out. And once I see that it looks the way that I want it, which is absolutely clear brand new brake fluid with no bubbles in it, then I know that it's good to go, so I can go ahead and move on to the next screw, which is the inner bleed screw on the opposite side of this caliper. You always want to start with the outermost screw and then move into the innermost screw. So just an interesting tidbit on the Miata Brake Master Fluid reservoir. If you empty it out and then refill it and you try to bleed the brakes, you're not going to get any flow. So you see that sort of circular thing in the center? You want to go ahead and just dip your finger in there and pump that up and down as your assistant is pumping the brake, and that's actually going to get fluid to start flowing out into the calipers, and then you'll be able to bleed. If you don't do that, you'll be at the caliper very confused as to why there's no fluid coming out, and you'll end up wasting some time. That actually happened to me, and I had to figure this out the hard way. I'd like to thank you all for watching and apologize once again for the issues with the audio. If you've enjoyed this video and the one preceding it, feel free to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so that you're notified when I post up another video. I promise future ones will have functional audio instead of narrations. If you have any comments or feedback or any questions, feel free to leave that in the comments section. And as always, once again, thank you guys for watching.